Folks. My name is Dr. Brian Elliott, and I'm the instructor for this course in social and political philosophy. I'd just like to explain initially the overall approach to the topic. Essentially, we have two topics that we're going to consider, or two phenomena that we're going to use to explore issues in social and political thinking. The first is the issue of work, and the second overall theme that we're going to look at is democracy. Now, at first glance, this might seem like an unusual pairing of themes. Democracy is a more obvious fit for a course in social and political philosophy. Work, not so much. And we begin with the topic of work. And so I'd like to explain a little bit as to why the theme of work is chosen here to bring us into the area of social and political philosophy. In this initial video lecture, we're going to begin with a contemporary thinker, someone who actually very recently died, but was active up until recently, and who is, in terms of disciplinary background, an anthropologist, but more generally a sort of social and political thinker who had a certain amount of influence, particularly in the last 10 years. And maybe I can just begin by looking at Graeber's piece called "On the Phenomenon of Bullshit Jobs." You can tell by the title that this is a little off the cuff, and certainly not your standard academic piece. Graeber wrote this, as he explains in many interviews, as a result of being asked by a certain magazine called Strike magazine to just contribute something that he thought would be polemical but topical. And he didn't have the usual restrictions that are imposed on academic writing. So he picked up something that, according to his own account of this, had been on his mind for some time, but it could have arisen through social interactions, particularly at parties, when he would explain, the inevitable question, "What do you do?" And he would say, I'm an academic anthropologist. Graeber was also an activist, and the person he was meeting for the first time in a party would say, "Oh, that's very interesting." Maybe ask him a few questions about that, and then Graeber would turn to them and ask them what they did, what was their job, what was their work. And very often, as Graeber relates, there was a sort of embarrassment in terms of relating what that work was, even though in many cases, the type of work that was identified wouldn't be particularly low paid, it wouldn't be low esteem, it wouldn't have low cultural capital connected to it. But there was an embarrassment because the work named didn't seem to be really very socially valuable or socially necessary. And on the basis of that, that set Graeber wondering why there was this sort of subjective sense of the uselessness of what so many people were actually doing. And so he wrote this piece in that appeared in 2013. It's a short piece. It's short and snappy and relatable. It's not written in an academic jargon. And so it seems to me it's a good piece to begin this class with. But to go back to the initial question that I posed, well, why begin with work, of all things, in the context of political and social philosophy? My account for this, or my explanation for this, my excuse, if you like, for beginning with work, is because for two reasons, I think. One, I think work is neglected as a political issue. Perhaps less so now, actually, since the pandemic. I first started teaching this class in 2019. And so we've gone through this phase now where this idea of essential workers received a lot of political and social attention for a brief period. But this was actually quite unusual against the backdrop of the last 40, 50 years. And the general sort of market analysis of this is that, you don't deal with jobs in terms of how necessary they are. You just talk about it in terms of consumer choices. And so in effect, no job is really necessary. It's just there because there's consumer demand, and, that demand fluctuates. And so jobs come and go. Sort of this idea of this sort of almost infinite flexibility of the kind of jobs and the job marketplace. And as long as there's, reasonable equilibrium, if you like, or balance between demands and supplies in the labor market, then, everything's fine. Now, thinking about it against that backdrop, that doesn't say anything about what you might call the subjective satisfaction that people experience around work. Usually the attention that we would give to this would be around whether you're in work or whether you're out of work, whether you're unemployed or in employment. And that itself, in a sense, sidesteps the question about the quality of work and the satisfaction in work. If the overriding imperative is to be in work, whatever it is, then, effectively the question, well, what type of work and what does it do for the workers, doesn't tend to, be front and center of discussions, right? So you hear, percentages of joblessness and so forth, or how many job vacancies and so forth are out there. But I don't believe that over the last 40 years, political cultures such as the one in the United States or the one in the UK, where I come from, have really focused on this issue of satisfaction in work. And I think there's a whole bunch of specific reasons why that's the case. But generalizing, I think under the conditions of what I'll call neoliberalism, and I will certainly come back to that notion of neoliberalism. It's a notion that will play a big role in this class, but I'll come back to it. But under those conditions of the last 40 odd years, the idea and the expectation is that everything serves the market, including, of course, us, the workers. And so, that's the systemic reason why the reverse question, well, not so much what does the worker do for the market, but what does the market do for the worker, or what does the job do for the person who does the job, has not really been a central political or social preoccupation. And I think there's a problem with that. And in fact, now that we've been 2 years plus into this pandemic situation, it seems that there's gathering evidence that, that created a sort of break in this sort of continuous sort of treadmill of working for working's sake. And that actually, with the sort of furlough schemes and money given in a very unusual way, to keep people going when they've been out of work through no fault of their own because of pandemic conditions, that this has actually created so-called great reevaluation. People have much more actively considered why they're doing the kind of work that they're doing. And we are, as everybody pretty much knows at this point, seeing shortages across all kinds of economic sectors. The restaurant sector, the retail sector, the travel sector, you name it. There are lots of shortages particularly in areas that would be rather, pejoratively referred to as low or no skilled, non-skilled sectors. And, there's complicated reasons for that. But I think one of the good things about this is that it has started to raise these questions about the nature of work and what it does for workers. So returning to, or picking up the Graeber piece then, which is the first piece that I'm asking you to read in this class. As I say, I think it's a pretty engaging read and a good place to start. We are going to delve into some pretty heavy theory, in short order. So, a sort of bright and breezy piece, I think, is a good way to begin to at least get into the topic, and hopefully, makes it a little bit easier to transition then to some of this older and more complex theory about the nature of work. So, as I mentioned already, Graeber is an anthropologist, was an anthropologist. He died in the relatively early phase of the pandemic at a relatively young age, in his 50s. He published a series of books prior to this. Direct Action is a fairly long book, around 500 pages, that draws on Graeber's own work as an activist, and in terms of his politics of anarchism. Graeber is an advocate of anarchism, and we'll see some different elements of that coming out. And then more prominently, this became, almost an academic sort of bestseller. His work, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, which was published 10 years ago in 2012. And the timing of this is important because it follows Graeber's involvement in the Occupy Wall Street movement. Graeber, as I said, was an activist as well as an academic. And really, the Occupy Wall Street was a reaction to the 2008 global recession. In the global recession, which began notoriously with the subprime mortgage market, whereby essentially a whole bunch of home loans were given to folks who had little to no prospect of repaying them. And that created a sort of cascading effect of folks defaulting on their mortgages, housing markets crashing, equity being lost, and so forth. And this was at the transition at the end of, in the United States, 2008-9, the transition between President Bush Jr. and the transition to Obama. And there was the American Recovery Act, which involved billions of dollars, actually trillions of dollars, being used to essentially pump up the economy. And there was a very clear choice that was made at the time by the American administration to basically bail out the banks, who were at the time referred to as too big to fail, as opposed to putting the majority of the money into people's ability to write off mortgage debt. And that decision could have been made, except that the banks were not willing to do it. Instead, a lot of people were evicted from their homes because they defaulted on the mortgages, and then the banks tried to recoup what money they could, and that was really the backdrop. And there was a lot of activism, and protest against this. That basically taxpayer money was being used to pay these multi-billion-dollar bank operations, and there were huge bank bonuses still being given at this point, where you're seeing people evicted from their homes because they can't keep up with mortgage payments. But at the same time, the big bosses of the big banks were getting paid millions in bonuses and so forth. So it created a lot of resentment. And from that time, we get the now sort of famous slogan, "We are the 99%." But the anthropological social question for Graeber is, why are debts considered to be sacrosanct when it comes to individuals, but not when it comes to institutions like banks? He looks at the sort of anthropological structures around jubilees, that is to say, releasing people from debt periodically, which is pretty much a social constant, and asks the question, well, why is it that in this particular time that our politics and our politicians and our political systems don't want to create room for the forgiveness of debt, wiping the slate clean? Obviously, at the moment, there's a movement that's just gathering a lot of steam around relieving folks in the US of student debt, right? It's an obvious, that's one of the cutting edge topics, I think, of politics in the United States today. The student debt is certainly one of the debts that you can't relieve yourself of. You can't, declare bankruptcy and get rid of student debts. And the question is why, particularly, and this could also links up to the job market, increasingly when the expectation is that, you have to have a college degree in order to get a decent job. It doesn't seem to be a discretionary thing anymore. It seems to be more mandatory. So essentially that debt is unavoidable. And then in 2018, so 5 years after the initial article, and on the basis of a lot more research and contributions from folks who reached out to Graeber to relay their own experience about their own work and their attitude towards it, he brought out a book-length study entitled "Bullshit Jobs." So it gives you a sense of the three major books that Graeber wrote in the last decade of his life, and a little bit about the backdrop. So getting into some of the detail then of Graeber's article on the phenomenon of bullshit jobs from 2013. Now, one of the things that Graeber tries to get into here is, what is the nature of a so-called bullshit job? And we also have to look at his somewhat rough and ready definition of what such a job is. One of the things that Graeber talks about is, where have the jobs gravitated to, in the last 40, 50 years? Now we have a kind of, we have a standard version of this, which has to do with, the demise of the manufacturing sector in economies like the US economy, the UK economy, and the so-called advanced economies, with some exceptions, to some extent Japan and Germany, but that's kind of the overall shift. So we have the rise of the service sector. But Graeber has a slightly more kind of a slightly different account of this, as we can see in this quote here. Graeber writes, but rather than allowing a massive reduction of working hours to free the world's population to pursue their own projects, pleasures, visions, and ideas, we've seen the ballooning of not even so much of the service sector as of the administrative sector, up to and including the creation of whole new industries like financial services or telemarketing, or the unprecedented expansion of sectors like corporate law, academic and health administration, human resources, and public relations. So, if I could pick up one of these examples that he gives of the so-called administrative sector, namely in the university or the higher education sector itself. So you can follow the numbers on this type of thing if that's what you want to do, but you take an institution such as the one that I work for, Portland State, and you can certainly see that over time, there's a kind of ballooning of administration. You have the sort of creation of lots of new administrative positions, and also to a great extent, the sort of the salary portion of the operation shifts away from what we would call frontline workers, in this case, people like me, teachers, but also the ancillary staff, the people who look after the buildings and so forth, And, you know, with more and more of the overall salary burden moving towards administrators, and, you know, being an administrator can be pretty lucrative if you're in sort of middle or upper management. You're typically earning a lot more than the folks who are, as it were, working on the front line. And so for those who are ambitious in a particular line of work, certainly the money element of things is to be found in the administrative elements of this. However, and this is, you know, where the bullshit element of this comes into play, often these administrative positions arguably don't have much of a vital significance to the actual running of the operation. So, you know, you might have a fancy title and so forth, and you, again, you may have a very good salary, but there's a sense in which administrative positions just get sort of invented out of thin air. And then, of course, you know, you have to define the position and so on and so forth. But there's, you know, ultimately the sense that it's not entirely obvious how these administrative positions serve the overall function of the institution in which they exist. But also there's another element to this quote, which is important, I think, to Graeber's thinking, namely the first element of it. So rather than allowing people to reduce their overall work, Graeber begins his article by talking about a prediction by the 20th century, early 20th century English economist, John Maynard Keynes, that by the end of the century, that's to say the end of the 20th century, so, you know, 22 years ago, people would be working on average, due to automation and streamlining of operations and so forth, would be working an average of 15 hours a week. And clearly we don't live in a world like that. So, you know, another way of posing, or another question here that's in play for Graeber is, why haven't we seen that type of diminishing of the work week? In the 19th century, you know, radical thinking, whether it be on the anarchist side or on the more socialist side of things, one of the overall values is reducing the working week. When the Industrial Revolution came about, in many ways, lots of the natural barriers that limited the work week were removed, because you had a shift from agricultural work to factory-based work. And agricultural work is obviously seasonal. You know, you have to do certain things in the daytime, and crops only grow, or certainly only vigorously grow at a certain time of the year, and it's a certain time you need to harvest, and so on and so forth. So there's all these natural limitations on the work day and the work week. You know, you'd have periods when you'd be very busy and periods when you'd be doing relatively little. When the bulk of the workforce gravitates towards a factory and artificial environment, and very quickly, you know, you have gas lighting, then you have electric lighting, and so on and so forth, there's already this push to endless production. You know, so the workday has no obvious beginning and end point. And certainly in the 19th century, and economies like the British economy, you know, you would have a 16-hour workday. It wasn't uncommon. And then workers had to organize in the 19th century in order to reduce that work day, until eventually, you know, by the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, we're kind of approaching this 40-hour a week, 5 days a week thing. But that had to be fought for. That wasn't something that just naturally arose, and it certainly wasn't done without a fight. So if you think of that as a natural trajectory, and you think of all of the efficiency savings and so forth that have happened, I say in the last 100 years, then, you know, someone like Keynes could predict that, well, you know, by the year 2000, the average person will be working only, say, 15 hours a week. And we clearly haven't inherited that kind of world. And the question is why? Part of the question around that, I think, has to do with, you know, obviously the living wage. If you're working for a certain amount per hour, and that certain amount per hour requires that you work, say, 40, 50 hours a week, then you're stuck in that system. But that in turn raises the question well, if there's a lot of added profit being made, where is it going? And then that's brings us back to the issue of, the split, if you like, between an administrative sector and a kind of frontline sector of the workforce. And, the idea being that most of the money is being siphoned off into the administrative class. So, one of the, we're already getting into this a little bit, but this sort of raises the question along the way of, well, what is giving rise to the so-called bullshit jobs? And I should say a little bit more about the bullshit job, and this is, depending on your analysis, you can see this as a strength or as a weakness. But a bullshit job is not as a characterization of a job. It's Graeber is using as his criterion the worker's assessment of their own job. So a bullshit job is really one that a worker finds to be largely pointless. Okay. Now, you can justify doing just about anything, right? As a job. And you might say, well, if it exists, then it's not bullshit. If people will pay money for that, or if you draw a wage, or someone will employ you to do that, then it's a perfectly good job, right? But the bullshit nature of this is to do with the worker's assessment of the work itself. That is to say that someone who's in a bullshit job feels that the job is largely pointless. Okay, so it's a subjective qualification of a job. As I say, you might find that too vague and sort of, and hence kind of annoying and not really solid enough to produce analysis on. But just to be clear, that's where the qualification bullshit is coming from in terms of the bullshit job, right? Graeber's principal task is to explain, well, why is there this proliferation of jobs that people find largely useless? And this is part of his answer to the question that he poses. He says the answer clearly isn't economic. It's moral and political. What he means by that is, if you think of the economy as, as sort of market fundamentalists do, the economy wouldn't produce useless jobs, right? Because why would you pay somebody to do something that has no value attached to it? So it doesn't add any value as such to the economy to have these jobs be in existence. So for Graeber, the answer has to be moral and political, as he states. And here's his further explanation of that. He writes, the ruling class has figured out that a happy and productive population with free time on their hands is a mortal danger. Think of what started to happen when this even began to be approximated in the 1960s. And on the other hand, the feeling that work is a moral value in itself, and that anyone not willing to submit themselves to some kind of intense work discipline for most of their waking hours deserves nothing, is extraordinarily convenient for them. Now, the latter part of this we'll elaborate on when we look at Max Weber's famous account of the work ethic. So I kind of defer looking at that until we turn our attention to Weber later in this lecture. But the other part of it, which again was touched upon in the previous quote, is to do with the perceived worry about freeing up time for the average worker, freeing them from work at work. The idea being that people will be more likely to disturb the status quo, more likely to become politically active, and so on and so forth. Now, this is interesting, right? Because we're going to look at this pairing in the sense between work in the first half of this class and then democracy in the second half. So, at first glance, you would think, well, if you want a vibrant democracy, if you want people involved in local politics, local associations, contributing to civil society, and so on and so forth, then it would be a great thing for people to have way more time to devote to such things, right? on the surface, you'd think, well, that's good, right? You don't want exhausted workers who are too, who just want to zone out because they're exhausted from work and all the other duties that they have to see to, and then at the end of the day, they can barely send off a ballot to vote every 2 to 4 years, right? But Graeber thinks that, the type of capitalist society that we live in is essentially repressive. And so it simply doesn't want the majority of people to have a lot of free time on their hands. It's too potentially subversive. But Graeber also reflects then on, what is the price, the cost, if you will, the social cost of the proliferation of so-called bullshit jobs. And this is an elaboration on what we've just seen. And he writes, what does it say about our society? That it seems to generate an extremely limited demand for talented poet musicians, but an apparently infinite demand for specialists in corporate law. And the answer to that question, if 1% of the population controls most of the disposable wealth, then what we call the market reflects what they think is useful or important and not anyone else. But even more, it shows that most people in these jobs are ultimately aware of it, aware of the pointlessness, in other words, of the job. In fact, I'm not sure I've ever met a corporate lawyer who didn't think their job was bullshit. So this comes out of an anecdote that Graeber relates, as you'll see, or you'll have seen if you've read the article, when he has an encounter with an old friend of his who's basically tried for a decade or more to make it as a musician. And as I think, if I remember rightly, maybe has a child and, is in a committed relationship and basically has to give up on his dream because, the music isn't paying the bills. And so ends up going to law school and training as a corporate lawyer. But, frankly, his heart isn't in it. It's not what he wants to do. It's not a vocation. He just goes into that because he thinks it's going to be lucrative and it's going to pull in a good family wage, and he can be a good father and a good provider and so forth, right? But the question, in some way, a kind of naive question, but still a very valid one, is, very few people would say, well, music's useless, right? I mean, what's the point, right? For most people, music plays a very important part in their life and is something that they value very highly. And they would feel that the world was very much a poorer place if there weren't musicians and there wasn't music to enjoy, even if you're not actively producing music. Most of us certainly enjoy listening to music and hearing it, whether it's live or, through a streaming device or whatever. So, this is the kind of the central question, right? And I think one way to pose this question is, how is there this discrepancy, this divergence? On the one hand, we have cultural and social value, things like music, art, theater, and so forth, dance, right? On the other, we have where all the money goes. And he's just talking about corporate lawyers, and, again, people might have different takes on the value of law and lawyers and so forth. But, it's hard to think that, people would come over all warm and fuzzy when they hear the word corporate law. And the point is, again, about this anecdote is that this person wanted to devote themselves to music. They were a musician. They obviously had a certain amount of talent, but there was no way to actually make any money out of that. And so Graeber is, wondering why this is the case. And, his most direct answer is, well, our economy is not democratic. Our economy does not reflect the general social values because it's a capitalist economy, which is controlled and conditioned by a small minority of the super wealthy. And this brings up the question of inequality, and we're certainly living through times in so-called advanced economies like the United States where inequality has been growing extremely rapidly since the 1970s. We had this sort of period mid 20th century which to many economists and social theorists was perhaps an anomaly, while we had, relatively decent economic equality for a generation or two. And that's been very rapidly changing since the end of the 1970s. And income inequality is high, and wealth inequality is stratospherically high at the moment in economies like the United States. The top 1%, certainly the top 0.1%, are hoarding vast quantities of income. And the bottom 20% essentially, it goes back to the other issue of debt, is it has no assets to speak of, and is often crushed by debt. So, Graeber is trying to bring these different pieces together. So the flip side of the sense of, having to sell out, if you like, take the corporate law job and give up the kind of the music profession, and give up what you love in favor of what brings in money, is what Graeber identifies as a kind of resentment against real jobs. Now, this is very curious, right? In the sense that if you do something that actually has this kind of social esteem, that is seen as, genuinely important from a social perspective, then it's almost like there's a sort of inverse attitude towards it, and that it's almost sort of scorned as a job. And these would be, to some extent, the kind of essential workers that were identified in 2020 when the pandemic really kicked in. So again, long quote from Graeber to bring out this point. He says that it's very clear in the United States, where Republicans have had remarkable success mobilizing resentment against school teachers or auto workers, and not significantly against the school administrators or the auto industry managers who actually caused the problems, for their supposedly bloated wages and benefits. It's as if they were being told, but you get to teach children or make cars. You get to have real jobs. And on top of that, you have the nerve to also expect middle-class pensions and healthcare. Part of what Graeber is getting at here is the so-called hollowing out of the American middle class. And this is a complex phenomenon, right? That has many causes to it. It's multi-causal. It's not unicausal in any way. But particularly aimed at public sector workers who are more than averagely unionized. One of the hallmarks of politics in the United States and the UK and many other places, so-called neoliberal political conditions under which we've lived for the last 40 years or more, is a very well organized campaign against labor unions. This, particularly in sort of popular press, this idea that, public workers, are kind of protected. They can't lose their jobs. They're not held to any sense of efficiency. That labor unions are sort of in cahoots with maybe the Democrats and so on and so forth. That they're an illegitimate influence on democratic politicians and all this kind of stuff, right? Now, what's significant about this, and it's very, very important, is that the labor unions have a long history that goes back into certainly as far as the mid-19th century. Initially, in the 19th century, as the Industrial Revolution kind of matured, workers naturally tried to self-organize into blocks so that they could do what we now refer to as collective bargaining. That's to say, they could come together as a group and go to the employer and say, well, we want these conditions improved, and we'd like a hike in wages. Obviously, if you go as an individual employee to your employer, you have little chance because you don't really have any leverage. If you go as a block of workers, then you have much more of a chance. But behind that, of course, was always the threat of removing your labor. In other words, striking, and using that, as it were, as your leverage, as your ultimate tactic for gaining better conditions and better pay. And since the late 1970s and early 1980s, again, these were the sort of Thatcher Reagan years in the UK and the US. There was a very concerted campaign to demoralize and to break the strength of unions, particularly in the public sector. And you can sort of follow the statistics on this in terms of how many US workers, for example, are in unionized workforces. And it's gone down precipitously, to such an extent that contemporary workers, particularly younger workers in the United States, have no firsthand experience of working in a workforce that is union protected. They know very little about labor law and the kind of protections. And of course, a lot of states in the United States are so-called right-to-work states, whereby an employer can sack an employee without stating a cause, so the few areas, one of the most obvious areas which remains unionized and is public sector in the United States, in fact, pretty much the only area of significance, is teaching. So it suits, if you like, the business class to project the sense of, the sort of lazy, out of touch, sort of asleep at the wheel type teacher who's protected by supposedly bulletproof tenure, and even though they're an awful teacher, they never get removed. Now, it would be foolish to say there aren't such individuals, but to use this as a critique of labor unions in general really doesn't hold water. And the other point, and probably the main point in this quote, is that Graeber is asserting that this type of tirade, this type of critique of workers like teachers or people who work in car factories and so forth, if they have good conditions at work, then this is something that should be celebrated. Because anything other than that is really to celebrate precariousness at work, working for minimum wages, not being able to afford, a basic, comfortable life, always living on the edge and worrying about slipping, into debt, and not being able to really have any kind of economic security. But it's also a way of deflecting away from the absolute massive salaries, income, bonuses, share options, and so forth, of the super wealthy. It's really a classic tactic of turning, if you like, the working class against itself. The other factor that Graeber is turning attention to here is that this idea, well, if you do what you love, you love, typically people like teachers are driven people. They want to do this. They want to make a difference. They want to, help young people think and become more skillful and more confident and so forth. If you're going to do that, if you're going to do something that you love, then don't expect to get well paid for it. And this is the kind of weird inversion, I think, that Graeber is interested in, because again, the bullshit job is not a low skill job. It's not, a bullshit job is not someone flipping burgers. I mean, someone flipping burgers is actually doing something useful, right? Because somebody has to produce that food, and a lot of people eat that food. Or, if you're a school janitor or whatever, right? It may be underpaid and not particularly high esteem, but it's a very important job to do, or a trash collector, and so on and so forth. These are not bullshit jobs. These are actually very necessary jobs. The bullshit jobs are the highly paid, administrative, essentially unnecessary jobs. So there seems to be this mutual exclusivity. You can either do a job that pays really well, but is essentially pointless, or you can do a necessary job that you feel very motivated to do, feels much more like a vocation, you feel very committed to, but then don't expect, in addition to that, in addition to the feel-good factor, if you like, to get paid well, which is, again, it speaks to this diversion between social value and economic value. So we've had a little dip into the Graeber piece. Hopefully you've got some of the underlying ideas, but just to kind of summarize and bring everything together on the Graeber article, because it is as I said at the beginning, it's a fairly casual, off the cuff sort of piece. So it's not systematically laid out in the way that an academic article generally would be. So just to kind of summarize then, what are the key points that are covered? First of all, the idea of bullshit jobs is that it essentially represents pointless work. It's not, to repeat, I found in teaching this material that a certain amount of students conflate and mistake a bullshit job for a poorly paid job, a kind of minimum wage job. That's not the idea. In fact, quite the opposite. The bullshit job is typically one that is highly remunerated and certainly not a minimum wage job. Those two things are quite distinct. So, but what the bullshit job highlights is essentially pointless work. So his initial premise, as we saw, is that the advanced service-based capitalist economy has thwarted the potential for a short working week by creating needless labor or bullshit jobs. What is the function of bullshit jobs? Well, part of the function is to prevent joblessness in a positive sense. Again, I think part of our neoliberal framework is to instill a kind of fear of joblessness. The idea that if you don't have a job, then you can't really have a social function. And that's something that needs to be questioned. Also, the idea of social pacification. In other words, you keep people in work to keep them quiet. You kind of tether them to certain types of debt, homeowners debt, student debt, just credit card debt. You just keep them working so that they won't do other stuff. They should probably be, be more socially impactful. And we saw Graeber referring to the 1960s. And the 1960s in economies like the United States were periods of full employment. And it was feasible for people to just drop out, as the phrase went at the time, and not completely implode. Certainly being in work these days doesn't prevent you from ending up in a very desperate state of affairs. So that sense of precariousness is constantly driven home to people. And certainly as an anarchist, Graeber believes that true human dignity stems from genuine autonomy. But the bullshit jobs present the reality of such freedom. So, underlying this for Graeber as a political anarchist is the imperative to keep on working. And that, as I say, if you're not in work, then you can't really be seen as fulfilling your social potential. Even though, as his examples show, the people that are actually truly driven to do culturally valuable things, such as music and so forth, are often thwarted in that desire by the fact that all the money is in other sectors. Graeber is also critical of what he calls the labor theory of value. And this is something that we're going to encounter in the next thinker that we consider, namely Karl Marx. Marx, by and large, represented the labor theory of value, although he does recognize the contribution that what he calls nature makes to social value as well. But Graeber, for his part, holds that the dominant economic theory that social value is created by labor paved the way for a neoliberal backlash that sees great innovative ideas as the key source of economic value. What's going on with that is, the idea of the Marxist idea, the Marxian idea of labor, is that, take a piece of land or whatever, right? Essentially, it's got potential value wrapped up in it, but that potential will only be realized through transformative human labor. So either by, for example, growing crops on it, but then you'll have to have a bunch of inputs, and you'll have to till the land, and you have to, sow crops or have animals graze on it or whatever it is. Or, think of a much more lucrative way of transforming the land, namely by building on it, which is itself a transformative labor process. And by doing that, you exponentially leverage the value of the land. If it's just land sitting there, a patch of wild woodland or whatever, it has very little, relatively little marginal economic value. So, there's some sort of intuitive obviousness to thinking, well, the value comes from the labor that transforms, something like land. During the neoliberal period, however, which is again, roughly a period stemming from the late 1970s on, so the last 40 years or so, we had to kind of shift away from that towards a kind of entrepreneurial idea of, great innovators and great thinkers, that, that's kind of where the value comes from. And that suits an economy that's going to sort of bloat the administrative class, right? You think of that in terms of a corporation or a business. You don't think of the value coming from, again, the frontline workers, the people who are actually transforming stuff, or in the case of a car factory, the people who are actually putting the cars together. You think of this in terms of the CEOs, right? Who have all these kind of wonderful ideas about how the company should be restructured, or better yet, you think of the consultants who come in and reorganize a business, right? Because these are the idea creators, right? In our own age of social media, this rhetoric that the real movers and shakers, the really valuable people, the people who have innovative ideas, has kind of been put on steroids. And you will see a kind of a much more extensive and nuanced critique of this trend when we look at the work of Richard Sennett, who thinks that, particularly sort of skilled artisans have been very much sidelined in the contemporary economy. And this idea that, you should be dynamic and just sort of, be an innovative thinker and be as flexible as you can be is really the paradigm of our own times. And that justifies, again, to a great extent, the massive inequalities in income that we see in companies in places like the United States. The idea being the guys at the top, the CEOs and so forth, they must somehow deserve these absolute massive salaries and bonuses and so forth, because, frankly, they're that much cleverer than anyone else working in the company. But this is a very particular way of framing a value. And so Graeber's point here is that there's been this sort of backlash against the idea that labor is the source of value. It's the idea that, that thinking, being a dynamic entrepreneur, is the real source of value. And the last point I think that we encounter in Graeber is the sort of the lived lack of dignity. So I think Graeber takes this quite seriously, that, a lot of the work in our contemporary economy damages the worker's self-esteem. The sense of the pointlessness of the work is, for want of a better term, spiritually damaging, right? And again, this is something that Sennett will touch on when he talks about the perceived uselessness, subjectively perceived uselessness of many workers in the contemporary economy. So that was an account of Graeber's piece on bullshit jobs. In the next segment, I'll turn attention to Karl Marx's influential and seminal examination of work under capitalism.